My teacher accused me of cheating because my story was too good for a 17-year-old. I got suspended with a cheating record that cost me my dream school. Even though I had all the proof showing it was my own work, the board still sided with her. Months later, she was arrested for selling test answers and exposed as the real fraud, while I was left fighting to clear my name. Now I have to decide whether to let her lies define my future or fight for what's right. This happened during my senior year at Westfield High. I was taking AP English Literature with Mrs. Rogers, who everyone said was tough but fair. The assignment was simple: write a 1,500-word short story in any genre we wanted. I chose to write about a World War II resistance fighter hiding in occupied France. I'd been fascinated by that period since 8th grade when my grandfather told me stories about his time in the war. I spent 3 weeks researching, hit up the library every day after school, read memoirs, historical accounts, even found some translated letters from French resistance members online. My story was about a young woman named Marie who worked as a baker while secretly passing coded messages to Allied forces through her bread deliveries. I was proud of it, really proud. The dialogue felt authentic. The historical details were accurate. I'd even included some French phrases I'd looked up to make it more realistic. I turned it in on a Friday morning, confident I'd nailed it. Monday morning, Mrs. Rogers called me to her desk before class started. She was holding my story, but her expression looked troubled. She told me we needed to talk after class. My stomach twisted. I'd never been in trouble with a teacher before. After the bell rang, she closed the classroom door and sat across from me. She said she was disappointed in me. I had no idea what she was talking about. She claimed my story was far too sophisticated for someone my age. The prose style, the historical accuracy, the mature themes. I tried to explain about all my research. She cut me off, said it read like something a graduate student would write, or something generated by artificial intelligence. The accusation felt like a physical blow. I insisted I didn't cheat, that I wrote every word myself. She shook her head, said the writing style didn't match my previous work. It was too polished, too professional. I explained that I'd worked really hard on it. She said she was going to have to report this to the administration. I asked what she was reporting. I hadn't done anything wrong. Academic dishonesty was a serious offense, she said. I left her classroom in complete shock. This had to be some kind of mistake. That afternoon, I got called to the principal's office. Mr. Thompson was sitting with Mrs. Rogers and the vice principal, Ms. Rodriguez. They had my story spread out on the desk like evidence at a crime scene. Mr. Thompson asked me to sit down. Mrs. Rogers had raised concerns about the authenticity of my creative writing assignment, he explained. I said I could prove I wrote it myself. I pulled out my backpack. Inside were 3 different notebooks filled with my research notes, character sketches, and rough drafts. I showed them all my planning materials, my handwritten drafts, everything. Mrs. Rogers barely glanced at them. She said anyone could write fake notes after the fact. I pointed out that these were dated. The ink showed they were written weeks ago. Ms. Rodriguez examined the notebooks. I could see her comparing my handwriting to my story. She confirmed the handwriting matched. Mrs. Rogers remained unmoved, said that didn't prove anything. Students could copy text by hand from AI sources. I asked why I would do that. It would take longer than just writing it myself. Mr. Thompson said they needed more time to investigate. I asked what they were investigating. I was telling them I wrote it. He scheduled another meeting for Wednesday, said I should bring my parents. Walking home, I felt sick. I'd worked so hard on that story. Now they were treating me like a criminal. My parents were furious when I told them. Not at me, but at the school. Dad immediately called Mr. Thompson to schedule a meeting. Mom started going through my notebooks, taking pictures of everything. She found my library checkout history on my account. Dozens of World War II books over the past month. She printed out my browser history too. Hours of research on resistance movements in occupied France. Wednesday arrived. We sat in Mr. Thompson's office like we were negotiating a hostage situation. My parents had brought a folder thick with documentation. Mom spread out my research materials. The dated notebooks, the library records, the browser history. She explained how I'd been interested in this topic for years, how my grandfather's stories had inspired my research. Mrs. Rogers sat there looking skeptical the entire time. She insisted the writing quality was too high, that 17-year-olds didn't write with that level of sophistication. Dad asked if she'd compared my story to my previous work in the class. She admitted she hadn't kept samples of my earlier assignments. Ms. Rodriguez suggested I could rewrite the story in front of them to prove I could do it. I agreed immediately, said I'd do it right then if they wanted. Mrs. Rogers said that wouldn't prove anything either. I could have memorized a pre-written story. The circular logic was maddening. Mr. Thompson said they'd made their decision. I was being suspended for 3 weeks for academic dishonesty. The suspension would go on my permanent record. My parents demanded to know what evidence they had besides Mrs. Rogers' opinion. Mr. Thompson said the teacher's professional judgment was sufficient. Dad asked to speak to the school board. Mr. Thompson said that was their right, but the suspension would stand pending any appeal. I walked out of school that day with a 3-week suspension for a crime I didn't commit. My parents immediately hired an attorney and requested a school board hearing. They also hired a handwriting expert to analyze my notebooks and story. The expert confirmed that all the handwriting was mine. The ink patterns showed the notebooks were filled over several weeks. She even found microscopic evidence that some pages had been written in different locations based on the paper's pressure patterns. We submitted a 20-page report to the school board, character references from other teachers, my complete academic record showing I'd never cheated before, even testimony from my grandfather about the stories he told me about the war. The school board hearing was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Mrs. Rogers came prepared with a PowerPoint presentation about the dangers of AI-generated content. She showed examples of sophisticated writing from various AI programs. Then she displayed my story alongside them, claiming the quality was suspiciously similar. My lawyer asked her to point out specific similarities. She couldn't, just kept insisting it was too good for a high school student. The board asked if she had any actual evidence of cheating. She said the evidence was the writing itself. My parents presented their documentation, the handwriting analysis, the research trail, the character witnesses. 3 of my other teachers testified that my writing had been improving all year. My history teacher said I'd written several excellent research papers about World War II. After 2 hours of testimony, the board went into closed session. They came back 30 minutes later. The chairman said they were upholding the suspension. They needed to send a message about academic integrity. The cheating allegation would remain on my permanent record. I couldn't believe it. All that evidence, and they still sided with Mrs. Rogers. The 3-week suspension started immediately. I missed crucial review sessions for my AP exams, missed college application deadlines while I was fighting the suspension. My college counselor had to explain the cheating allegation in her recommendation letters. 3 of my top choice schools rejected me outright, said they couldn't accept students with academic integrity violations. I ended up at my safety school, a decent college, but not where I'd planned to spend 4 years. The suspension felt like it had derailed my entire future. But things got interesting during the spring semester. Rumors started circulating about Mrs. Rogers. Students were saying she'd been acting strange, missing class more often, seeming distracted and nervous. One day in March, she didn't show up for school at all. The substitute teacher said she was dealing with a personal matter. A week later, the rumors exploded. Mrs. Rogers had been arrested. The story came out in pieces over the next few days. A student named Tyler had been caught selling test answers to other kids in his chemistry class. When questioned, he said he'd bought the answers from Mrs. Rogers. The police searched her classroom and found copies of tests from multiple subjects. She'd been stealing answer keys from other teachers and selling them to students for months. They also found gradebook records that had been falsified. Students who'd paid her had received higher grades than they'd earned. The investigation revealed she'd made over $8,000 selling academic materials. She was fired immediately. Criminal charges were filed for fraud and corruption of minors. The school district launched an internal investigation into all her classes. Dozens of grades had to be recalculated. Several students lost their honor roll status when their real grades were revealed. I watched all this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and rage. The teacher who'd destroyed my reputation for allegedly cheating had been the real cheater all along. My parents immediately contacted the school board. They demanded my suspension be overturned and the cheating allegation removed from my record. The board's response was pathetic. They said Mrs. Rogers' criminal behavior didn't change their decision about my case. The evidence against me had been evaluated independently of her later actions. My lawyer sent them a strongly worded letter pointing out the obvious irony. The teacher who'd accused me of academic dishonesty was guilty of systematic academic fraud. How could they trust her professional judgment about my integrity? The board refused to budge. They said changing their decision would set a dangerous precedent. That was when my parents decided to take the nuclear option. They hired a private investigator to look into Mrs. Rogers' background. What they found was shocking. She'd been forced to resign from her previous school district under suspicious circumstances. Multiple students had complained about unfair grading and accusations of cheating. Sound familiar? The investigator found 3 other students from her previous school who'd been falsely accused of academic dishonesty. All had been high-achieving students whose work was deemed too sophisticated. All had been punished despite providing evidence of their innocence. Mrs. Rogers had a pattern of targeting her best students with false accusations. The investigator theorized she felt threatened by students who wrote better than she expected. Rather than acknowledge their talent, she destroyed their reputations. Armed with this information, my parents went back to the school board. This time, they brought the other victims with them. Jennifer from Mrs. Rogers' previous school had been suspended for writing a too advanced research paper about climate change. Marcus had been accused of plagiarism on a poetry assignment that was beyond his capabilities. Jennifer had been failed for submitting a short story that was clearly written by an adult. All 3 had suffered consequences. Lost scholarships, been rejected from colleges, had their academic reputations destroyed. The school board finally agreed to another hearing. This time the evidence was overwhelming. Mrs. Rogers had falsely accused multiple students across 2 school districts. She'd shown a clear pattern of targeting high-achieving students with baseless cheating allegations. Her own criminal behavior proved she lacked the integrity to judge others' academic honesty. The board voted unanimously to overturn my suspension. The cheating allegation was removed from my permanent record. They issued a formal apology for the mishandling of my case. But the damage was already done. I was halfway through my freshman year at my safety school. The colleges that had rejected me weren't going to reconsider their decisions. I'd lost a full scholarship to my dream school. My entire educational trajectory had been altered by one teacher's false accusation. The school district offered to pay for my tuition difference as compensation. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Mrs. Rogers eventually pled guilty to the criminal charges. She was sentenced to 2 years probation and had to pay restitution to the students she'd defrauded. Her teaching license was revoked permanently. She'd never be able to destroy another student's future. But that didn't undo what she'd done to me and the others. I transferred to a better school sophomore year using my cleared record. The admissions office was sympathetic when they heard my story. They said false accusations of academic dishonesty were more common than people realized, especially in the age of AI, when teachers were increasingly paranoid about generated content. I graduated with honors and got into a good graduate program, but I always wondered what my path would have looked like without that suspension. Would I have gotten into my dream school? Would I have met different people, had different opportunities? There's no way to know. What I do know is that Mrs. Rogers taught me something she never intended. That authority figures can be wrong, that institutions can fail you, that sometimes you have to fight for the truth even when everyone tells you to give up. I also learned to document everything. Every assignment, every draft, every piece of research. I keep detailed records of my work process because I never want to be falsely accused again. It's sad that I have to live that way. But Mrs. Rogers' betrayal made me more careful, more thorough, more prepared. In a twisted way, her false accusation made me a better student and writer. I just wish it hadn't cost me so much in the process. The other students she'd falsely accused reached out to me after the story broke. We formed a kind of support group for survivors of academic persecution. All of us had been high achievers who'd been punished for our success. All of us had been told our work was too good to be real. The experience bonded us in a way that's hard to explain. We understood what it felt like to have your integrity questioned by someone you trusted, to have your hard work dismissed as fraud, to be punished for excellence instead of rewarded for it. Some of the others had worse outcomes than me. Jennifer had given up on her dream of becoming a scientist after her suspension. Marcus had dropped out of advanced classes and barely graduated. Jennifer had developed anxiety around writing and switched to a completely different major. Mrs. Rogers' false accusations had ripple effects that lasted for years. She damaged not just our academic records, but our confidence and self-worth. It took therapy for some of us to recover from the psychological trauma. Being called a cheater when you've worked honestly is a special kind of violation. It makes you question everything about yourself. Did my work really deserve the grades I got? Was I actually as good as I thought? Was everyone just being nice to me? Those doubts can eat away at you if you let them. I was lucky to have parents who believed in me and fought for me. Not every student has that kind of support system. Some kids would have just accepted the punishment and moved on. They would have internalized the message that their best work wasn't good enough, that they weren't capable of producing quality writing. Mrs. Rogers could have crushed my love of writing entirely. Instead, she made me more determined to prove her wrong. Every good grade I got after that felt like a small victory against her false narrative. Every piece of positive feedback from professors was evidence that she'd misjudged my abilities. I started writing for the school newspaper partly to spite her memory. If she thought I was too unsophisticated to write well, I'd prove her wrong publicly. My articles got picked up by regional publications. I won several journalism awards during college. I even got published in a national magazine while still an undergraduate. Each success felt like another nail in the coffin of her accusations. I was building an undeniable record of authentic achievement. After graduation, I became a freelance writer and investigative journalist, partly because I loved the work, but also because Mrs. Rogers had taught me the importance of uncovering truth. She'd shown me how much damage could be done when lies were accepted as fact, how institutions could fail people who trusted them, how authority figures could abuse their power to destroy innocent lives. I decided to make a career out of exposing that kind of corruption. My first first major investigation was about grade manipulation in public schools. I found 3 districts where administrators had been altering test scores to meet state requirements. The story won a state journalism award and led to several resignations. I dedicated the award to Mrs. Rogers, wherever she was. She taught me that academic fraud came in many forms. Sometimes it was students cheating on tests. Sometimes it was teachers and administrators cheating the system. Her hypocrisy had opened my eyes to the bigger picture. Over the years, I've investigated dozens of education scandals, principals embezzling funds, teachers selling grades, counselors falsifying transcripts. Each story reminded me of my own experience with institutional betrayal, the feeling of being gaslit by people in positions of trust, the frustration of having evidence dismissed because it didn't fit someone's preconceived narrative. I've helped expose corrupt educators and vindicate falsely accused students. It's become my mission to hold academic institutions accountable. Mrs. Rogers probably thought she was ending my academic career when she accused me of cheating. Instead, she set me on a path toward a career built on exposing exactly the kind of fraud she was committing. The irony is almost poetic. Last year, I got a message from a high school student in Ohio. Her English teacher had accused her of using AI to write a short story. Despite providing drafts and research materials, she'd been suspended for academic dishonesty. The teacher claimed her work was too sophisticated for a 17-year-old. The story was painfully familiar. I connected her with a lawyer who specialized in education cases, helped her family document the appeals process, wrote an article about her case that got picked up by national media. The school board eventually overturned her suspension. The teacher was reprimanded for making accusations without proper evidence. It felt like completing a circle that had started with my own false accusation. I couldn't change what had happened to me, but I could prevent it from happening to others. That student is now in her freshman year at a top university. She's majoring in creative writing with a minor in journalism. She says my article inspired her to use writing as a tool for justice. Another person whose path was shaped by encounters with educational corruption. The cycle continues, but hopefully in a more positive direction. Mrs. Rogers is long gone from education, but her legacy lives on. In the students she falsely accused who learned to fight for truth. In the policies that were changed because of the scandals she helped expose. In the awareness that even teachers can be the ones cheating the system. She thought she was protecting academic integrity when she destroyed my reputation. In reality, she was the one corrupting it. Her false accusation taught me that integrity isn't about blindly trusting authority. It's about standing up for truth even when institutions fail you. It's about documenting your work so thoroughly that lies can't take root. It's about fighting back when you're wrongly accused even if the system is stacked against you. Most importantly, it's about using your experience to protect others from the same injustice. Mrs. Rogers wanted to make an example of me. She succeeded, just not in the way she intended. I became an example of what happens when you falsely accuse an innocent person. When you underestimate a student's determination to clear their name. When you abuse your position to settle personal scores against excellence. The message she sent wasn't about academic integrity. It was about the consequences of educational corruption. And that's a lesson I've spent my career teaching others. 10 years later, I have no regrets about the path my life took. The suspension was devastating at the time, but it led me to my true calling. I might never have become an investigative journalist without Mrs. Rogers' false accusation. I might never have developed the skepticism and determination that drive my work. Her betrayal was the catalyst that turned me into someone who fights institutional corruption. She made me stronger, more resilient, and more committed to justice. In trying to destroy my future, she actually shaped it into something more meaningful. I should probably thank her for that, but I won't. Because what she did to me was unforgivable, even if it accidentally led to good things. She destroyed my trust in the educational system at 17 years old, made me cynical about authority figures when I should have been learning to respect expertise, stole opportunities I'll never get back, and forced me down a harder path than necessary. The fact that I succeeded despite her sabotage doesn't make her actions any less cruel. It just proves that students are more resilient than corrupt teachers expect them to be. Recently, I decided to dig deeper into Mrs. Rogers' background for a book I'm writing about educational corruption. What I found was even worse than I'd imagined. The private investigator had only scratched the surface back in high school. Mrs. Rogers had been falsely accusing students for over 15 years. Her first documented case was at a middle school in Pennsylvania in 2003. An 8th grader named David Chen had written what she called an impossibly sophisticated essay about immigration. His parents were recent immigrants from Taiwan who barely spoke English. Mrs. Rogers claimed there was no way David could write better than his parents could speak. She accused him of plagiarism and had him transferred to remedial English classes. David's confidence was shattered. He stopped participating in advanced programs. His parents, intimidated by the school system and their language barrier, didn't fight the accusation. David never recovered academically. He dropped out of high school at 16. I tracked him down through social media. He's now 35 and works in a factory. When I called him, he immediately knew why I was reaching out. He said he'd been following my articles about Mrs. Rogers for years. Said it helped him understand that what happened to him wasn't his fault. He'd spent decades thinking he really was a fraud, that his good work had been a fluke. Mrs. Rogers had convinced a brilliant 13-year-old that he was incapable of academic success. The psychological damage was irreversible. After Pennsylvania, she'd moved to a high school in Delaware. 3 more false accusations between 2005 and 2008. All high-achieving students. All accused of work being too advanced for their age or background. A girl named Ashley who wrote poetry that was too emotionally mature for a 15-year-old. A boy named Michael whose science fair project was clearly done by a parent. A girl named Samantha whose historical research paper showed graduate-level analysis. All were suspended or failed despite providing evidence of their authentic work. Ashley stopped writing entirely and struggled with depression through high school. Michael switched out of all advanced science classes and never pursued his dream of becoming an engineer. Samantha's suspension cost her a scholarship to her top-choice college. The pattern was always the same. Mrs. Rogers would target students whose work threatened her sense of intellectual superiority. She'd find reasons to doubt their authenticity rather than celebrate their achievements. Then she'd use her authority to destroy their academic standing. From Delaware, she'd moved to a middle school in Virginia. 2 more cases between 2009 and 2012. Then the high school in North Carolina where I'd first heard about her reputation. 4 documented cases there before she came to our district. By the time she accused me, she'd been ruining students' lives for over a decade. I'd been her 20th known victim. But here's what really made me sick to my stomach. Every single one of us had been high achievers from middle class or lower income families. She never accused the wealthy kids whose parents could afford lawyers and private schools. Never went after students whose families families had connections to the school board. She picked victims who looked vulnerable, who wouldn't have the resources to fight back effectively. Kids like David Chen, whose immigrant parents were intimidated by the system. Kids like Ashley, whose single mother worked 2 jobs and couldn't take time off for school meetings. Kids like me, whose parents believed in the system and trusted teachers to be fair. Mrs. Rogers was a predator who specifically targeted students she thought couldn't defend themselves. She'd miscalculated with my family, but others hadn't been so lucky. I started reaching out to her other victims to interview them for my book. The stories were heartbreaking. Michael told me he'd loved science since elementary school, had dreamed of becoming a NASA engineer, but after Mrs. Rogers accused him of having his parents do his science fair project, he lost all confidence in his abilities. He'd actually done the entire project himself, including building a working model of a water purification system, but she insisted it was too complex for a 7th grader to understand, let alone build. His parents, both teachers themselves, were devastated that a colleague would make such accusations without evidence. They provided detailed photos of Michael working on the project over several weeks. They brought in character references from his previous teachers. They even offered to have him rebuild the entire system in front of administrators. The school refused, said Mrs. Rogers' professional judgment was sufficient evidence. Michael was disqualified from the science fair and received a failing grade on the project. He never entered another science competition, never took advanced physics or chemistry classes, became convinced that he wasn't actually smart enough for scientific pursuits. He's now a sales manager at an office supply company. Not that there's anything wrong with that career, but it wasn't his dream. Mrs. Rogers had killed his passion for science with one false accusation. Ashley's story was even more tragic. She'd been writing poetry since she was 10 years old, had won several local contests and been published in teen literary magazines. Her English teacher before Mrs. Rogers had encouraged her to submit work to national competitions. Then Mrs. Rogers arrived and decided Ashley's poems were too sophisticated. She claimed a 15-year-old couldn't possibly understand themes of loss and grief the way Ashley wrote about them. Never mind that Ashley's father had died in a car accident when she was 12. Never mind that her poems were clearly processing that trauma in age-appropriate ways. Mrs. Rogers accused her of copying adult poets and submitting their work as her own. Ashley provided drafts showing her creative process, character references from her previous teacher, even recordings of herself reading drafts aloud. Mrs. Rogers dismissed all of it as fabricated evidence. Ashley was suspended for plagiarism and banned from the school literary magazine. The suspension went on her permanent record and cost her a scholarship to a prestigious summer writing program. More importantly, it destroyed her confidence as a writer. She stopped writing poetry entirely, convinced herself that Mrs. Rogers was right, that her work had been derivative and unoriginal. She developed severe anxiety around creative expression that lasted through college. She's now an accountant who hasn't written a poem in 20 years. Sometimes she thinks about starting again, but the fear of being called a fraud still paralyzes her. Mrs. Rogers had murdered a young artist's creative spirit over jealousy and spite. Samantha's case was particularly infuriating because it involved family history. She'd written a research paper about the Holocaust using her grandmother's first-hand accounts as a survivor. Her grandmother had kept detailed diaries during her time in hiding and had shared those stories with Samantha since childhood. The paper combined historical research with personal family narrative in a way that was both scholarly and deeply moving. Mrs. Rogers claimed it was too mature and showed graduate-level historical analysis. She refused to believe that a 16-year-old could synthesize primary and secondary sources so effectively. Samantha brought in her grandmother to testify about the family stories. Her grandmother, then 87 years old, sat in the principal's office and recounted her experiences during the war. She showed them the original diary pages and explained how she'd shared these memories with her granddaughter. Mrs. Rogers actually had the audacity to suggest that the grandmother was lying, that she was helping her granddaughter cheat by providing too advanced historical perspective. The disrespect was staggering. This was a Holocaust survivor being called a liar by a mediocre English teacher who couldn't accept that a teenager might be a gifted historian. Samantha was still suspended despite the family testimony. The incident was so traumatic that her grandmother stopped talking about the war entirely. She'd tried to pass on important historical memory to her granddaughter, only to have their family stories dismissed as academic fraud. She died 3 years later, taking those memories with her because she'd lost trust in anyone outside the family. Mrs. Rogers hadn't just destroyed a student's academic record, she'd severed a vital connection between generations and silenced an important historical witness. The more I learned about her other victims, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about bad teaching or poor judgment. This was systematic abuse of power designed to crush students who dared to excel. Mrs. Rogers had targeted young people during the most vulnerable period of their academic development. High school and middle school students who were just discovering their intellectual capabilities. She'd convinced them they were frauds, that their best work was somehow illegitimate. The psychological damage was profound and lasting. Many of her victims never fully recovered their confidence as students or professionals. They'd internalized her message that excellence was suspicious, that achievement beyond expectations was probably cheating. Some had changed career paths entirely to avoid fields where they might be accused of being too good. Others had settled for mediocrity rather than risk standing out and attracting scrutiny. Mrs. Rogers had created a generation of former gifted students who were afraid to shine, who second-guessed their abilities and downplayed their achievements, who chose safety over excellence because a teacher had taught them that success made you a target. I decided to organize a reunion of her victims for my book research. We met at a hotel conference room in Richmond, Virginia, roughly halfway between where most of us lived. 15 former students ranging in age from 25 to 38, all of us carrying scars from our encounters with Mrs. Rogers. The stories we shared over that weekend were both heartbreaking and infuriating. But there was also something healing about finally being in a room with people who understood, who knew what it felt like to have your integrity questioned by someone you'd trusted, who'd lived with the self-doubt and anxiety that comes from being falsely accused. We started calling ourselves the Rogers survivors, half joking but also serious. We'd all been through a form of educational trauma that was rarely recognized or discussed. The meeting was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. For years, each of us had carried these experiences alone. We'd wondered if we were overreacting, if the damage was really as serious as it felt. Being together proved that our responses were normal and justified. Mrs. Rogers had harmed all of us in similar ways. We compared notes on the long-term effects, trust issues with authority figures, imposter syndrome in professional settings, anxiety around performance evaluation. Several people had sought therapy specifically to deal with the academic trauma. Others had struggled with depression and self-worth issues that traced back to their false accusations. The psychological impact had been far more severe than anyone realized at the time. We also shared survival strategies and success stories. stories, how we'd rebuilt our confidence and found ways to excel despite her sabotage, the careers we'd built and the achievements we'd accomplished, the ways we'd turned our experiences into motivation for fighting injustice. Many had gone into education themselves, determined to be the kind of teachers Mrs. Rogers wasn't. Others had become advocates for students' rights, or worked in fields focused on protecting vulnerable populations. We'd all been shaped by our encounters with corruption, but we'd channeled that experience into positive change. The reunion became an annual tradition. We stay in touch throughout the year, supporting each other through professional challenges and personal milestones. We've become a chosen family, bonded by shared trauma, but focused on collective healing. Some of us have collaborated on projects related to educational reform. Others have written memoirs or articles about their experiences. We've testified before school boards and legislative committees about the need for better protections against teacher abuse of power. Mrs. Rogers probably never imagined that her victims would band together like this, that her false accusations would create a network of advocates working to prevent similar injustices. She thought she was destroying individual students. Instead, she was creating a movement of survivors who would dedicate their careers to exposing educational corruption. The book I wrote about her case became a bestseller and sparked nationwide conversations about teacher accountability. It led to policy changes in several states requiring more rigorous evidence before academic dishonesty charges can be filed. Several school districts implemented new protocols for investigating cheating allegations. Students now have better protections and clearer appeal processes. The book also inspired other survivors of educational abuse to come forward with their own stories. I received hundreds of emails from people who'd experienced similar injustices. Teachers who'd falsely accused students of cheating, plagiarism, or other misconduct without proper evidence. Administrators who'd covered up teacher misconduct to protect their reputations. School board members who'd prioritized politics over students' welfare. The scope of the problem was much larger than I'd realized. Educational corruption takes many forms, and false accusations are just one piece of a larger puzzle. But they're a particularly insidious piece because they target students' core identity as learners. They make young people question their abilities and doubt their achievements. They teach students that excellence is dangerous, that standing out makes you a target. They create a culture of mediocrity where students learn to hide their talents rather than develop them. Mrs. Rogers represented everything wrong with that system. Her legacy isn't just the individual students she harmed, but the broader message she sent. That teachers' egos are more important than students' potential. That authority figures can destroy lives without consequences. That institutions will protect their own rather than seek justice for victims. But our legacy as her survivors is different. We've shown that students can fight back and win. That false accusations don't have to define your future. That trauma can be transformed into advocacy and positive change. That justice is possible, even when it takes years to achieve. Most importantly, we've proven that Mrs. Rogers failed in her ultimate goal. She wanted to crush our spirits and convince us we weren't as capable as we believed. Instead, we became more determined, more resilient, and more committed to excellence. We've achieved things she never could have imagined when she was trying to tear us down. We've used our experiences to help other students avoid the same fate. We've built careers and lives that prove her accusations were not just wrong, but ridiculous. We've become the kind of successful, confident, accomplished people she was probably jealous of all along. Her jealousy and insecurity drove her to try to destroy us. Our resilience and determination ensured that she only made us stronger. In the end, that's the real lesson of the Rogers case. Corrupt authority figures may have temporary power to harm innocent people, but they can't control how those people respond to injustice. They can't prevent victims from finding each other and supporting each other. They can't stop survivors from using their experiences to create positive change. Mrs. Rogers thought she was writing the end of our stories when she falsely accused us. She was actually writing the beginning of our real journeys. The paths we've taken since her accusations have been more meaningful and impactful than anything we might have achieved if she'd left us alone. She inadvertently gave us a mission and a purpose that has defined our adult lives. We owe her nothing for that. She caused tremendous pain and damage that can never be fully undone, but we've taken control of the narrative and turned her attempt at destruction into a catalyst for justice. That's probably the best revenge we could have asked for, and it's a victory she'll never be able to take away from us. 20 years from now, when people remember the Rogers case, they won't remember her as a teacher who exposed cheating students. They'll remember her as a corrupt educator who was brought down by the very students she tried to destroy. They'll remember us as the survivors who refused to be silenced and fought back against institutional injustice. They'll remember this as a story about resilience triumphing over abuse of power. That's the legacy I can live with. That's the story I'm proud to have been part of. And that's the message I hope other students will take from our experience. Fight back when you're falsely accused. Document everything and never give up. Find allies and build support networks. Use your voice to prevent others from suffering the same injustice. Turn your trauma into advocacy and your pain into purpose. Don't let corrupt authority figures write your story for you. Mrs. Rogers tried to convince me I was a cheater and a fraud. Instead, she taught me to be a fighter and a truth teller. That's not the lesson she intended to teach, but it's the one that mattered most.